Okay, wonderful. And I believe that we are live now. All right. Well, thank you both so much for being here today. Today, I am joined by Alena Dillon and Margo Littell. Alena Dillon is a creative writing teacher from Boston, and today she's going to be chatting with us about her debut novel, Mercy House, which is also going to be adapted into a TV series for CBS All Access, produced by Amy Schumer, which is very cool. Keep an eye out for that. And yes, we are also chatting with Margo Littell, who spent her entire life studying writing. She has an MFA from Columbia and has written several novellas and short stories. And today she's going to be talking with us about her second novel, The Distance from 4 Points. And before I turn the time over to the two of them, I just wanted to go over a few of the upcoming events at our bookstore. Tomorrow, December 1st at 7 p.m., some of our pals from Arcadia Press are going to be in conversation with each other. Landspeed Louise Ann Noth is going to be talking about her new book, Images of America, Bonneville Salt Flats. And she's going to be joined by Nick Bagley talking about his book, Abandoned Utah. And then on Saturday, December 5th at 2 p.m., Steve Creason is going to be sharing some poems from his latest collection, Big Day, a short film that he shot on 16 millimeter, and a music video from his daughter, Fern Creason, which will be really fun. Yeah, and so with all that being said, I am going to disappear for a little bit. If any of you have any questions for Alena or Margo, please feel free to comment them down below, and we'll end with a little Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks so much for having us. So we thought that we would share just a little bit about our books and a short excerpt just to give you a taste, and then before jumping into the conversation. So I'm gonna jump off here. So Mercy House is my debut novel that came out in February. It's about a nun who is investigated by the Vatican for breaking church doctrine and how she operates her women's shelter in BedStuy, and she is investigated by a bishop with whom she shares a dark history. So I'm just going to read the first page and a half or so just to give you a sense of the tone. Sister Evelyn knew she was on call that night. It was her turn to answer any knocks or rings after midnight. And so when she heard the first tentative rap at the door, she groaned and pried one eyelid open just enough to read the red numbers glaring from the digital clock on her bedside table, 2:43 a.m., an ungodly hour. Evelyn burrowed deeper into her pillow. She'd answer the door. She would, after 30 more seconds of sweet rest. The second strike was more assertive. "Get your lazy bones out of bed, Evie," Sister Josephine cried from the neighboring room. "This is your calling, after all." Evelyn struggled up onto an elbow. "If you're awake enough to be clever, you're awake enough to answer the door yourself." She was satisfied with that response and waited 20, then 40 seconds for Josephine to stir. When her housemaid ignored her, Evelyn sighed, pushed herself upright, and began the painful process of extricating herself from bed. Ever since Evelyn entered the convent 50 years ago and was required to rise with the sun, she worshipped sleep like it was a false god. But now that Evelyn was 69, the physical difficulty of making her way from her cot to the ground was a relatively recent development. Her body had thickened, her bones had become brittle, and her joints were stiff and reluctant to bend. Every inch of her skeleton creaked when used, but gouty arthritis precipitated the worst of it. The condition swelled her toe, tightened her ankle, and sent a burning ache through her knee. The slightest movement was a reminder of her nearly decade-long status as a senior citizen. Certainly when God created man, he knew human life expectancy would eventually extend. Couldn't he have designed the aging process to be just a bit more graceful? Even half a century after her formation period, Evelyn could still hear the response of her first Mother Superior. "Who are you, young novice, to question the will of Almighty God?" Hobbling around in the darkness of her bedroom, Evelyn muttered, "Forgive me, Lord. I am but your meek and humble servant. But you, Mother Superior, you can kiss my fat Irish ass." So I'll end it there and pass it over to Margo.
Thank you. I love that opening. It's so beautifully rated. So my novel is called The Distance from 4 Points, and it is my second novel. It came out in May, And this novel is set in Appalachia, and it's about an affluent suburbanite who is forced to return to her Appalachian hometown after her husband unexpectedly dies, and she must undertake the renovation of some rental properties that he secretly blew their savings on. So her goal, along with her teenage daughter, Haley, is to renovate the properties and get tenants as quickly as possible before anyone reveals Robin's secret past as a teenage prostitute. So I'm going to just read a little bit towards the beginning of the novel, a page or so. In this section, Robin has just finished collecting rent as a landlord for the first time. Robin took another Advil and poured a glass of wine. The winter gloom hid the fact that it wasn't yet 5 o'clock. It could have been worse. She'd been expecting some version of the Laurel Estates trailer park crowd from her childhood. Rough, mean, aggressive dogs, dirty kids, 40s on the windowsills. These people, the Trundles, the nun, Deirdre, even Anne, were manageable. Still, Anne and Sister Eileen hadn't paid their rent. 2 tenants, $800. She took a long drink of wine, the last bottle left from Mount Rinda, and opened the shoebox where she'd stuffed the cash from the day. Without thinking, she laid it out on the coffee table, instinctively separating the bills and shuffling them to face the same direction. She tamped the stacks long ways, then sideways, deftly evening the edges with an open palm. She rarely dealt with cash in Mount Rinda, maybe 100 at a time from the ATM, but it came back to her, the cottony softness of the bills, the way even the most wrinkled ones assumed their neat place in the pile. The memory was unwelcome, the feel of the thick stack in her fist. When she tallied the cash in her hand and recorded it on the spreadsheet glowing on her laptop, she watched as calculations were performed automatically, turning text from black to red. Robin feared an errant keystroke would erase the whole thing. She tried to make sense of it, the notes and columns, the figures and sums and dates. If anything went wrong, a leaky faucet, a clogged drain, a bird cracking a window, misguided, unfortunate skull, she'd never get home. She was surprised at how easily the high wire calculations returned. She hadn't been extravagant in Mount Rinda, hadn't whiled away the school day hours shopping at the nearby Galleria as so many of her women friends did, collecting Longchamp totes in multiple colors and mooning over Schumacher hothouse flower drapery fabric at $300 a yard. Undeniably, though, she let her thriftiness slide. Her yoga pants were made from recycled plastic water bottles and cost $89 a pair. She'd changed her perfume with the seasons. She'd spent the past 20 years not pinching pennies, assuming that their life was built to accommodate indulgences without complex budget adjustments. She never had to skip a phone payment to fill a prescription, substitute a car repair for groceries. Now, just like when she was young, she was keeping her hard-earned money in a shoebox, hoping the shallow well of bills wouldn't run dry. It was a mindset of scarcity. Robin reached for it, stacked it in the box alongside the cash. So I'll start there, and I'll throw a question your way to begin. I love your character, your lead nun, and I'm so curious about what drove you to write about her, and what was most difficult to get right, because she is a very determined and feisty nun with a troubled, traumatic past, but she also has her own share of personal mistakes that she's made with her family relationships that have sort of isolated her in a way. So what was most difficult to get right, and what inspired you to write about Evelyn?
Yeah, I think you touch right on what was most difficult to write was, I always have trouble with this, is letting my characters make mistakes and not saving them from their flaws. So I arrived at the idea of Evelyn when I was working at a Catholic college in Long Island. I was there for about 5 years, and I was just super inspired by all the women there. I had never been around nuns before, so I kind of had this preconceived notion that they would be, upright and pious and sterile and uninteresting, but they were so complex and fierce. And Evelyn is inspired by one of those nuns in a high-ranking position who was kind of this huge presence on campus. I didn't know her that well, but she would kind of storm down hallways and always had something to do. And she was gritty and had a sense of humor. And she was in her 70s. And at the end of the day, she would go on and sleep overnight at a women's shelter. And there was this story about her that ended up being the opening of my novel, which is that overnight, when anyone came knocking at the door, she would groan before getting out of bed and going to open the door. And that struck me as so nun-like, but so human. And I guess that was kind of my revelation that nuns are humans, of course. And so they are as complex and interesting as anybody. And then it was during this apostolic visitation, which was the investigation of all American nuns. So I just wanted to look into that further. And the more I learned, the more I was inspired to write this story about nuns who are so dedicated, but so underappreciated by their institution. But the hardest thing to write about Evelyn was her family relationship, because that seemed to me one of the most heartbreaking parts of her character that she was responsible for in a way. So a lot of terrible things happened to her and she endured a lot of pain, but she played an active role in this relationship, these grudges that she held with her family for allowing her to be forced into the convent in the first place, and then kind of losing touch with her when she needed them most. So having those scenes where there could have been an easy reconciliation and she could have welcomed them in when they reached out to her, and having her kind of push them away was tough for me to write as a writer who loves my character, but it was necessary, because if you just solve their problems really quick, there's no story.
That's very true.
Yeah. So when we came together, it was by serendipity. And our novels could have been totally different. But as I was reading, I was marveling at how much overlap there was. There was so many thematic places that we shared, and the characters are similar in their own ways. And we have like smaller characters are the same. And so one of the things that struck me was that both of our characters are kind of experiencing this coming of age story after what is commonly the coming of age period in a person's life. So I was wondering what brought you to that in particular, to a woman in middle age having to reinvent herself.
Yes, it's true. I like that about our novels, that we are both writing about women on the older end of the spectrum who you don't normally see having these like major revelations and transformations. With Robin, what I really was compelled by when I started creating her character is that I think if it hadn't been for Ray's tragic death and then the revelation that he had spent all their money on rental properties, she probably would never have made a change, and she would have just kind of skated along to the end of her life, closed off, having her past walled off from herself and from her daughter and from other people who were trying to care about her. And she wouldn't have changed anything, because from her view, what she had built was working. She had built a new life that had nothing to do with her past, and no one caught on. And she thought she'd gotten away with something, and she was happy-ish. But Robin has always been a little bit passive in her new life. And so when Ray died and finally she did have to go and take control and put a roof over her and Haley's head, that was the catalyst for her. And so she was in her 40s and she was forced to start again. And, it was kind of like the universe saying, time to change something, time to open up, time to start fresh. And so that was her journey, was a sort of a forced transformation. It was a forced coming of age, but she embraced it ultimately. She chafes against it. She doesn't want to be back in her hometown. She wants to get out of 4 Points as quickly as possible. Her nightmare almost immediately comes true because a person from her past, her former best friend, Cindy, crosses her path and becomes her tenant and sort of yanks her into the present and forces her to realize that the past and the present are actually not that separate after all. But for me, it was definitely it was an externally forced transformation. She came to it, she did it, but it was tough. So I think, how about Evelyn? Do you feel like she was sort of forced into this coming of age, or do you think she would have gotten there herself?
Yeah, I think it's kind of the same situation where this obstacle is thrust in their path and they have to confront it, and through confronting it they have to face their past. So when the bishop arrives at Evelyn's house to investigate the women's shelter, suspecting that she's breaking church doctrine, she has to face the abuse that she's repressed her entire life, and that has informed so many of her relationships. Because of her abuse, she hasn't allowed herself to be loved, to be made vulnerable, to reconcile with her family, and confronting the bishop and trying to overcome his influence makes her it makes her face that head on. So yeah, I think it's a very similar situation for Evelyn, but what also to let everyone in on what we were talking about before the recording, what you were saying reminded me of your experience this year, actually, when the pandemic forced you to kind of change your life and move, because you're like, all the rules are gone, like we're not playing by the playbook anymore. So these things happen all the time in our lives where we're confronted with these unexpected changes, where otherwise we were kind of coasting along and we're like, well, why change? Things are going kind of fine. And then, something like the pandemic hits and you no longer have all the kids are in school, or we're commuting this way, and all these other obligations, and all your tethers are kind of cut, and you're like, well, now's the time to change. And that's right.
All the excuses melt away, and there's nothing to do but move forward.
Yeah.
What our characters have in common as they go through these transformations, that they both have to overcome an enormous amount of shame. And it's sexual shame. For your nun, Evelyn, she, has this horrible traumatic past of rape and sexual abuse. My character, Robin, she has a past as a teenage prostitute. She was sort of forced into it by circumstance. And both of them, they really embrace this as somehow being their fault, whether they tempted the priest or whether they could have done something else to earn much needed money. This is their train of thought. It's really difficult for them to come through that and acknowledge that it wasn't their fault. And, that's key to sort of having them move forward. But Sister Evelyn confronts her shame and tells her story in a very public way. And I'm wondering if that was always your plan, for her to reveal this in the dramatic scene of the church.
Yeah, no, it was not. So this book, like most books, went through a whole lot of versions and revisions and transformations, much like our characters. But actually, the climactic scene at the end that you're referring to was totally my agent's idea. So I give all the credit to her. This is my first novel, and it's my first experience working with professional people in the industry. So my agent and then my editor. And I don't think I realized what a major collaboration it is when you bring a book somewhere. So I had already gone through so many revisions with my book, and then I gave it to my agent, and then we kind of rewrote the last third together. She had that huge climactic scene that it all leads up to. I had it kind of being like a more quiet ending that just it kind of petered out. It lost energy. And so when she described this scene that she had in mind, it just clicked with me completely that it would be this cinematic revelation in front of people, and it felt so right. And I was so excited to go write that scene, and I wrote the scene very quickly, and then it was really exciting to uncover like that kind of thing together. And then when we submitted it to my editor, then she had other ideas for from the halfway point to that 2/3 point. So then we worked on that together. So yeah, it was exciting to have this book about a group of really strong women who work together, and then having it being brought into the world by a group of strong women who work together. So that was really exciting.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
So that kind of transitions us into a craft question, if we can just talk about a second, because that's such a big revelation where we know her story, but that's the first time she really publicly shares it. And it's such a hard decision in writing a novel about when to share your character's secrets.
Right.
I know I struggled with that a lot.
Yeah, I was wondering that.
Yeah. So when to reveal Robin's past, and how much of it to make a secret, and how much of it was just something that should be accepted from the get-go. So maybe we can each talk about that, because that's really, I think, as a writer, one of the hardest things to do is know what to withhold and what to offer from the
Right, because like you're kind of just like you have everything in your hand, right? Or by the end you do. I mean, like, so it took me a few versions to figure out who my story, my character's backstory. So I kept picking up cards and putting the cards back down, and my hand got shuffled. But by the end, I had all of my cards in my hand, and yeah, you have to figure out when you're going to show it to the reader and when you're going to have your character reveal it to the other characters. So yeah, so for me, it was wondering, when to reveal to the reader that the bishop who comes to investigate is the one who assaulted Evelyn. So I tried it a couple of different ways, like, because I didn't want to feel, or I didn't want to make the mistake of just being so excited to have this information that I wanted to give it up front. So I tried having it, later in the book. But then it ended up just kind of shifting its way forward so that when the bishop arrives and there's this tension, what's at stake for Evelyn. So like the readers needed to be in on that, even if the other women in the shelter didn't know it yet. So that's what determined when I revealed that, is that I wanted, by the time the bishop arrived at the house, we have this information so we can feel the heat of it. But I was wondering that about yours, because you kind of held on to it a little bit longer, which I really admired, because I had that temptation which I gave into ultimately, to kind of put it up front. So yeah, tell us a little bit about how you decided.
I would say I didn't hold on to it as long as I was tempted to.
Oh, your other secret about her, like the rest of Robin's backstory, you held on to a little bit longer. The teenage prostitute, you might have put up a little up front.
Yes.
You had a separate secret that you held on to.
Correct, about the baby.
Yes.
So there's two big secrets in my novel, and it's both traumatic things from Robin's story. One is that she was this teenage prostitute, but the other major thing is that she loses a child that she has as a teenager. And neither thing was intended to be like an aha moment. And that's the danger, I think, when you withhold information from the reader, it takes away from the impact, because it suddenly becomes this like, wow, look at this dramatic surprise, and it's not supposed to be a dramatic surprise. It's supposed to be something that builds character and that informs every action that she has taken and will take. And so for me, in the revision process, it was a process of moving things forward more and more and more. And so when the teenage prostitute piece came, that was right at the beginning, I think in maybe the first scene or the second scene. But we know when she's driving back to 4 Points with her daughter in the passenger seat, there is a major thing at stake for her. She cannot let her daughter find out about her past, because she thinks that would ruin everything. And so that really, that ratchets up the tension, because we know something that is a 13-year-old probably would be very surprised by and unhappy with if they found that out about their mother. And then when we find out about her infant and his tragic death, like that is also, it's not a surprise, but it's something that shades and deepens her hatred and her fear of being back in 4 Points. And so I think, not to pile on to my protagonist, but I was kind of piling on, things are dark, and they're getting darker because now she has to confront all these memories that she had, which is kind of the way of things when you return to a place where you don't want to be. The atmosphere seeps into you and gets heavier and heavier and heavier. And that's kind of what I was doing with layering in these pieces of her past. I even hesitate to call them secrets so much as just pieces of her past that she has to embrace and actively confront in a way that she hasn't in a really long time.
Yeah, and while we're on the subject of the baby, were those some of the most painful as a writer and as a mother writer to write for you in the book? What were some of the more challenging scenes to play out and the emotions to deal with?
Absolutely. I think anytime you're writing about a child, once you become a mother, and really any person writing about a child, it's charged, it's difficult. In my first novel, Each Vagabond by Name, there's a kidnapped infant who is never found. And the interesting thing about writing that novel was I had written it years and years before it was published, the first draft of it. Of course, this was before I became a mother. I was much younger. But I ended up doing a major rewrite and an expansion of it years later. And I had just had my second daughter at that point. And so I would write some of these revised scenes of this kidnapped child and the mother's grieving while I was holding my infant, in an ergo. We were living in Brooklyn at the time. I'd be in a cafe. I'd be typing these terrible scenes with this baby on my chest about this grieving mother. It was a really strange and uneasy, craft piece because it was too real. And I felt at that point that I was kind of writing my own fears.
Yeah.
I think that goes into it with Robin as well. It's always something, it's a terrible nightmare. And I was definitely writing my way into something that I couldn't fully understand, but that I was trying to.
Sure. And you do a really great job balancing that emotion so that you're not overwriting it, because losing a child is the absolute pinnacle of pain, right? So it would be easy to get melodramatic there. Was that something that you had to actively balance out, to not harp on the grief too long, or did that just kind of come naturally?
It came naturally because at that point I was trying to write it. I know Robin so well, and she had spent 20 years or more at that point burying that grief and burying that event. And so when it does emerge in the story, it's also sort of emerging for her, but it's not going to be as raw and fraught as it would have been had, she had just experienced.
Right.
It's coming in layers and layers and layers of repression, basically.
Right. So there's already distance built in.
There's distance built in. Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, yeah. Let's see what we can.
So another commonality that we had was the actual house, right? So the Whistletop Roadhouse for you, where Robin has to return to, and just dealing with structures in general, because she becomes this tenant or this landlord in a town that is kind of trying to be revitalized. And so buildings are very important, but there's one specific building, her former house, that is extremely important. Mm-hmm. And obviously Mercy House for me, the women's shelter that Evelyn is trying to save and that the women in Mercy House are trying to save, is super important. So that struck me as an overlapping theme when reading. And I was wondering what brought you to that element of the story. Were you writing about a particular town undergoing this revitalization, as well as the acknowledgement section? You say that this book kind of inspired you to buy an old house and restore it. So I wanted to hear about that.
Yeah, this book was really kind of a chicken and egg situation. I was inspired to write it because my hometown in southwestern Pennsylvania sort of has a major problem with property blight. So there's beautiful old mansions. It was a formerly wealthy coal town, and a lot of these old mansions still remain, but they have been neglected and abused and split into triplexes and sort of run into the ground by negligent landlords who just will put tenants in over and over and over again and just take as much money from the property as they can get without doing any repairs or renovations or maintenance. But these homes have so much old, beautiful detail still remaining. And so I was always inspired by these places and intrigued by them. And so I wanted to write about them. And so that sort of became the backdrop for The Distance from 4 Points. And while I was researching, I had a realtor take me around to a lot of these properties to go inside, the ones that were for sale or for rent. And there was one that my husband and I fell in love with. It was a shell. It was a beautiful ruin. But friends of ours actually ended up buying the house and invited us to partner with them on restoring it, which we did over the course of about 1.5 years. And we had stars in our eyes. We thought we would renovate it to its former glory and then sell it. And it would just be like this offering, which is great. And we restored it and it was beautiful, but we couldn't sell it because it was in this small town in southwestern Pennsylvania. And so I ended up becoming a landlord because we had to rent it out. And so my protagonist and I sort of converged and both became small town landlords.
Oh my gosh, that's so funny.
Yes, and it was really interesting to sort of work on my book and revise the book with this new perspective about landlording and tenants and that whole world. So the house on Whistle Stop Road was loosely based on this house that we ended up not selling. Well, we have sold it now. But that was a strange real world and fiction sort of blurring together.
Did you find, like, after you started living this experience, did you find that you'd gotten it right as a writer?
I had gotten some things right. What I found most troubling was that I feel like I was too hard on the landlords in some cases in my novel, because I suddenly had the other side, the other view. Like, you can't do a million renovations and you can't respond, to every maintenance request, because you will never make ends meet as a landlord. So I kind of didn't like that I had to treat them as less than the villains that I thought they were. That was, a difficult shift in perspective.
But that makes it more complicated, right? That it brings out the human quality. That was something that I struggled with too when crafting this Bishop character, is that I was like, he's such a villain, and I was thinking, like, should I round him out a little bit more? And ultimately I decided not to, that it didn't serve the novel to do that. But as I read reviews from readers, which I do every day, which is a terrible habit, but that is something that is often brought up. And I totally agree. That was something that I considered doing and had to weigh the merits of, and ultimately decided it's not his story. And this is, like, from Evelyn's perspective, how to be treated, he should be treated. But for the landlords, like, that was, bringing out their humanity is an important quality, and makes it's so interesting when you sympathize with people that also are acting as the villains.
Yeah, it's I think inevitable when you begin writing. Even the most monstrous character, I think now and then there's a spark of something that seems more human.
Mm-hmm.
You had a nice balance in your book, because Hawkins was so evil, but then you had Father John, who was so wonderful and generous and open. And I feel like that was the piece of the priesthood that you wanted to see.
Right.
You can't make a blatant statement about all priests or all bishops. So that was like the counterpart. That was the balance. And I think that really worked well for you.
Yeah, I wanted to be careful not to make this an anti-Catholic book. That wasn't my intention at all, especially since I admire these nuns so much, and, like, everything that the nuns represent is all that is good in Catholicism. I know there are bad nuns, but that's not what the story is about. So yeah, like, I didn't want people to think that I was on some sort of raid against Catholics, because there's so much beauty. Like, it's not a book about Catholicism being bad, but about, the individual Catholics who have done bad things. And so that was a balance. And also because my father's family is Catholic, and my husband's family is Catholic, and these nuns who I still work for St. Joseph's College. So, so I definitely wanted to give, like, this fair portrayal and a true portrayal. So yeah, I wanted Father John was one of those avenues, and I just loved Father John so much.
I think you did such a great job. I mean, I'm a Catholic, and I think you did a great job of really being accurate of how Catholics pick and choose what they go along with, and how they're able to still feel joy and faith and connection despite all of the hardships that the church is facing. So I really felt like you did a great job with that. I love that about your book, that it was such a generous view, and it was so optimistic, that it is possible to, sort of balance faith with criticism, the faith in the things you believe, and the criticism of the things that obviously are so wrong. So that was so well done.
No, thank you.
Yes. I'm curious about your connection to BedStuy, which is where Mercy House is located. What drew you to write about BedStuy?
So I grew up in Queens, or I didn't grow up in Queens. We moved when I was a kid, but all my family is still there. So I was often in Queens. So I kind of had that, like, that informed the larger kind of feeling of the area. But I chose BedStuy in particular because Mercy House is based very loosely on Providence House, which is the women's shelter that the nun who this book is very loosely inspired by. That's the women's shelter that she sleeps over at in Brooklyn. And Bed-Stuy is a neighborhood that is kind of later to gentrify. So I wanted to place Mercy House in a neighborhood that would serve the population best. And that was close to the nun's mother house in Clinton Hill, which is a kind of a contrasting neighborhood that's a little bit more gentrified. So when I was building Bed-Stuy, I had already moved. I currently live in Massachusetts. So I had been living in Long Island, and then we moved to Massachusetts. And that's when I started writing the book, because I just missed these nuns in that area. So I was kind of writing a love letter to them. So I had to rely pretty heavily on Google Maps. So I would, which was really helpful. I mean, I've been in these neighborhoods, but I really need to kind of revisit and imagine. I don't have a great memory recall, maybe, or imagination. I don't know. I need to see it concretely. So I was doing a lot of dragging and dropping that yellow man in Google Maps and walking around virtually and looking around and picking where her street would be and what the neighborhood was like and the adjacent avenues and things like that. So yeah, it was kind of I chose BedStuy based on some real places, as well as my childhood kind of culture, and then the research that I was able to do from afar.
Great. That's great. So can we talk about your journey to publication? I know this is your first novel.
Yeah, sure.
Coming out in the spring. So it's always interesting to hear, how long did it take from first idea to published book?
Sure. Yeah. Long. Yeah. So I started, I mean, I've always wanted to be a writer. That was always the pursuit since I was a kid. But I seriously pursued it following college. So I'm 34 now. And when I've been writing since I graduated, like having part-time jobs here and there, getting my master's degree. And this is certainly not my first book. So I have about 6 manuscripts that are like, taking up memory on my computer. That came before this. Some will never see the light of day. Some maybe I'll try to transform into something workable. I had 2 agents before, and they submitted to like big places, and we got some lovely rejections, but all rejections. And yeah, as I was getting later and later in my 20s, I was like, well, I've only worked part-time jobs. So at some point I need to, if this is not going to happen for me, I need to decide that I just like apply for a real job and have a career shift. And that's what I'm going to do. But my husband was like, give it one more year, give it one more year. And we kept renewing that for about 5 years. And then in May of 2018, I got another agent. And I was telling myself, it's just gonna be like the other ones, like they're gonna submit it and it's not gonna happen, and then I'll have to write something else and I'll get a different agent, and then it just happened really quickly after 10 years of just submitting and writing and nothing. We actually got interest from Hollywood first, so that was interesting. Is they got my film agents in LA, and they submitted, like they passed it around their agency. And that's what got Amy Schumer's attention. And so I had a phone call with her before a publishing deal. So that was super exciting. And then we got a publishing deal very shortly after. And then, yeah, it's been so nice to finally have found people, who I rely on and advocate for my work. And it's just a matter of finding those right people, because I'm not any different of a writer than I was before, but suddenly I have people championing my work and people I can shoot quick emails to, and they respond, and it's just a completely different experience because I kind of happened on the right submission at the right time. What was your experience like?
My experience with my first novel was very similar. It took a long time to write. It was actually a novella originally. And then I actually got an agent for the novella, but she wanted me to expand it into a full-length novel, which I did. But then it made the rounds and got a lot of rejections. And then she left the agency and or left the world of agenting completely. And so I had this little orphan novel that couldn't really be taken on by anybody else. So I began submitting it on my own to small presses and contests, and finally connected with the University of New Orleans Press and won their University of New Orleans Publishing Lab Prize. And they published it in 2016, which was just so serendipitous, and they did such a wonderful job with it. And then they published my second novel as well. So that was an easier story the second time around. But you're right. I think it's all about luck and timing and finding the right reader for the right book. So,
yeah.
It's not a very encouraging story in some ways, but also an encouraging story. You just have to be patient. That's the key.
Yeah, absolutely. And that you just keep hoping that eventually the timing will be right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Were you writing your book, I guess, during Me Too, or was it sort of inspired by that?
So I started writing in 2015, which was kind of as things were picking up there. And that movement totally reshaped my book, because it was going to be, I mean, the book went through all sorts of different versions, but I had originally thought that it was going to be about what brings nuns to this kind of commitment, to this life of faith. So following Evelyn kind of through her life leading up to this event. But the more I watched women standing up and sharing their stories and then inspiring other women to do the same, and realizing how many are out there, and how this kind of power structure keeps women silenced, certainly influenced the plot structure. So I have this kind of cast of dynamic characters who had always been there, but with the Me Too movement, I realized that they needed to be a stronger presence, and I wanted their voices to be heard. So it was those women who made me realize that I needed to give them an opportunity to share their story on their own terms, with their own voice. So that's what made me write chapters from their perspective. So that was certainly inspired by the Me Too movement, is that kind of narrative of standing up and sharing their stories, and what brought them to Mercy House in the first place. And so that was a joy to get to know those characters more, and to have them, share that experience with Evelyn, even if they didn't realize it, even though they kind of sensed it. And then having that climactic scene at the end was kind of like the ultimate like revelation for Evelyn, and that certainly has the flavor of this Me Too strength and camaraderie. So yes, it is certainly a Me Too book, and I was fortunate to be able to witness like the power of that movement while I was writing it.
That's interesting. Yeah, what I like about Evelyn's revelation too is that it's so meaningful for her to be able to share that story publicly. But it doesn't have the effect on the women that she fears deep down that it will, because they rally around her. They don't shun her. They don't blame her. They don't shame her. They support. And Robin has sort of the same experience when she finally does share her story with her friend Steph from Mount Rinda. Steph doesn't turn her away. She accepts her, and she is just another part of her person. And Robin never saw it that way. She saw it as something separate and something terrible. But it's not, it's all part of her. And when she tells her daughter, Haley, finally the truth about her past, Haley says, that's interesting. But to her, it's not just one more piece of her mother that she can now process and move forward with. So I think that's also the power of storytelling. When something traumatic happens in a life, sharing that story can be so powerful, because it shows that you're not alone, and it's not something that's reason for shunning. It's something to be embraced.
Yeah, so, I mean, when you're keeping something like that to yourself, it lives between you and everybody else, right? So like you kind of have to erect these walls, and you never really truly connect with anybody because they don't know maybe all of you. They only know the part of you that you let them see. So that certainly had influenced all of Evelyn's relationships. And so as soon as she's able to kind of drop those walls and share that part of herself, she's able to let love pass more freely between her and other people. And yeah, with Robin, the same is true. Like she learned to trust other people to love her, and to love all of her, including the stuff that she wasn't proud of. So yeah, and it's such a hopeful end, a hopeful note to both of our books at the end is letting our characters shine as their true self and be accepted by the people that they care deeply for.
Were you tempted ever to have a darker ending?
There were quieter versions in which she shared her story, but not on such a public stage. But she always shared her story, because that was ultimately the arc that needed to happen for her, is that she needed to learn to love and to be loved the way that she encouraged the women in the shelter to do. I was tempted to have a neater, more satisfying ending for like as far as retribution goes, but it would have been indulgent, I think, if I followed the story all the way through to like what happens to the bishop after Evelyn reveals what he's done to her. That would have been for me. That would have been to satisfy me, and it would have gone beyond the scope of Evelyn's arc. So I had to cut it off somewhere. But what's been really fun as part of like the screenwriting experience and having the book be developed into a TV series is that I've gotten to see the pitch for what would potentially be a second season. So I get to like have somebody else like, pitch what would happen beyond the pages of my book. So perhaps in that way I can live vicariously through following the bishop to the end. But what's heartbreaking about it too is that they have to throw all these like, new conflicts at Evelyn. So she's 70 years old and like she's been through so much and she finally got what she needed. And now, there might be a season 2 where she has to face all new obstacles. But
I mean, as an author now, and you have to sort of let go of that because she's sort of almost not your character now.
Yeah, she's belongs to the world.
Right. That's exciting. It's a really interesting thing to think about is when your character will have a life beyond you in a way that is still very active.
Yeah. Yeah, because you have like, even if, you're not writing what happens beyond the pages, and even if you don't really consider it, you have this like feeling, right? Like there's this, a shade of hope, or, you kind of send them off and they can live happily. But even if they have, turmoil, at least you don't have to see it. But yeah, to have it all be, dug up again. But
so your story is, it's set in the present day. So, did you have any thoughts about your characters operating in the pandemic? Because I couldn't help thinking back in May when the novel was released, putting my characters in this situation and thinking, wow, what would they be doing right now? Who's wearing a mask, who's not wearing a mask? And it's so easy for me to know who in my novel is an anti-masker.
I know. I think I have some suspicions about your characters too. Yes, I certainly thought about that. So my novel set in 2010, which seems like a lifetime ago, but you're right, it's basically contemporary day. So yes, I was wondering like how Evelyn would have fared. Like she's older, so she's an at-risk population, but
Right.
it's not in her nature to shut the doors and isolate. So yeah, like she would certainly let people in. I don't know, maybe she'd have quarantine rooms for new women that enter. Maybe she'd be outside and like telling people to put on masks. Yeah, it is interesting.
It's interesting. It's also a really difficult exercise and it made me happy that I was not actively writing the novel right now, because I think it would be hard not that you would want to incorporate it on the page, but it would be hard not to have it in the back of your mind of maybe trying to change the time period to way before this. I don't know. I'm just really happy that I did not have to do any fresh writing.
Yeah, in a way, I was thinking about this too. Like even no matter when your novel is set, I feel like as you're writing, all of the issues of today are kind of in a way filtering into the work. Like I found myself as I'm revising a piece, like there's a police officer character and I'm like reevaluating him in a way after the Black Lives Matter movement and all that in June. And so I wonder, and just more general themes of like isolation and family and all the things that we're reconsidering this year. It's hard to compartmentalize that and stay focused on your story without all of that informing. So yeah, even for books that are not set in 2020, I wonder if there will be a pattern of themes that emerge within the next like 5 years of writing.
Yeah, or even things taking on a weight or significance that they wouldn't otherwise, like a group event or a party or a holiday, things you would never give a second thought to, or now they'll just take on this significance because if it takes place before the pandemic, you'll know, oh, well, that can't happen. And
right.
Because you won't be doing that again. It's interesting.
Right, exactly. You better enjoy it while it lasts.
Yeah, you better enjoy it.
Yeah.
Yes.
I know. I think of that too. Like when I'm watching television now and like someone comes to a door, I'm like, put on your mask. Like, what are you doing?
I know.
It's almost like everything's a horror movie now.
That's a really good way of putting it. Yeah.
Do you find that, well, as you're writing this year, that you're kind of you're inadvertently projecting certain themes onto your work or certain tones?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a darkness emerging in what I'm currently working on that I hadn't expected. Yeah, we'll see how it plays out, but I think I don't think it'll appear on the page, but I think it will be there in spirit.
Right.
Yeah.
And then it'll depend on what the reader's mindset is too. I mean, like, as people are reading now, they're, projecting those things on to books that were written years ago. And so I guess it depends on the mood. It's like when you put a piece of art into the world, it's only, complete when the reader arrives to it. So it's what the reader brings to it. It's what you brings to it. It's a whole mess of variables.
Exactly. It's a fluid process.
Yeah.
What are you reading right now? Anything really wonderful?
Let's see. What am I reading? So I recently finished Teresa Ann Fowler's book from this year, The Good Neighbor. That was really talk about like the Black Lives Matter book.
Oh, so timely. It's hard to get.
Yes, I couldn't believe it. I was like, how'd you know all of this was going to happen? So, and like such well-balanced characters, like, as you said earlier, like villains who also have this element of humanity. They're not, villains all the way through. And just like, yes, very dynamic characters, a very interesting setting. Something that like, the conflict begins with a tree in a backyard, and that seems like so insignificant, but it's like the meaning is huge.
Yeah.
What about you?
It was a really beautiful book. I've read so many good things lately. The book that got me out of my pandemic reading rut, because I was so hard to focus back in March, was Lily King's Writers and Lovers, which I absolutely adored. It was just so spot on about the writing life and ambition and disappointment and excitement. It was just a beautifully rendered book. And right now I'm reading a book called The All Night Sun by Diane Zinna, which is just a beautiful book as well. It's about the grieving process and about intense friendship between two women. I haven't finished it yet, so I don't know how it ends, but I'm really enjoying it.
Oh, yeah, I'll have to look into those.
Yeah, so good. Yeah. Oh, here's Salem.
Hi, Salem.
I saw you pop up.
Yeah, well, thank you both so much. I'm back to ask you a couple of questions to round off the night. The first is, so you've both crafted these really intimate stories about women overcoming sexual trauma. And I feel like you both touched on this a little bit earlier in the conversation. I'm a huge believer in literature as catharsis and the power of like representation and storytelling. And my question is, what do you hope that your readers, all of your readers, but in particular women that have gone through similar struggles, will take away from your work?
Do you want to go ahead, Margo?
Sure. I think, I mentioned something similar earlier, and I think what I would hope they would take away is that, two things. One is the power of telling your story and being open about your own history as a way of finding support systems. And also, I think it's a realization Robin comes to when she really starts opening herself up to her new life, and that is that the past and the present cannot be split down the middle. They are, to have a full life, you have to sort of embrace both and have a life that encompasses your entire timeline. And so I think that idea of not splitting things off and incorporating everything into a whole person is, I think, it's something I would like people to take away as sort of a positive idea.
So yeah, I wonder, I would hate to force the book on, like, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to somebody who is still struggling with trauma, because I know like it could be very triggering to read those types of scenes. But if somebody felt that they were ready to read, I would hope that there would be some relief in finding something they recognize and someone they recognize on the page. I know that I experienced that when I identify something in a character that seems to reflect myself back, that you feel less alone, right? So I guess that feeling of finding community. And then for people who haven't experienced sexual trauma, it's kind of the converse is like you never empathize with I find storytelling is one of the tools that help us empathize the most, because we are placed in the position of a character who has experienced things we haven't. So we have to live those backstories and live those experiences and feelings, and so we kind of flex those empathy muscles. So I think that is an exercise that would be really important to everybody, whether they've experienced sexual trauma or not.
Thank you both very much. My last question for y'all is, I would just love to hear about any upcoming projects that you have.
Sure. I happened to bring an ARC just in case.
Ooh.
So this is the happiest girl in the world. It's due out in April. It is about a gymnast who is training for the Olympics and all of the sacrifices that that kind of commitment requires, including, losing your childhood and physical sacrifices, emotional, all your family sacrifices. It also brushes up against the culture of abuse in USA Gymnastics. So when the Larry Nassar story broke, I was kind of in the middle of Mercy House. And so that was all on my mind. And it seemed like I wanted to kind of segue into how a world can be built in which a person like Larry Nassar is able to survive. I kind of brushed on that in Mercy House with the Vatican, but I mean, it's really hard to build a world in which the Vatican is demonstrated. And so, the seeing like the training in the gyms is kind of more, it's easier to put on the page. It follows a girl from when she's 6 and starts training up until when she is about 18, which is like when bodies kind of give out. So that's due out in April. And I had mentioned before the recording that it was supposed to end at the 2020 Olympics, which when I submitted my revisions in March, I learned was being postponed. So I had to do a really quick rewrite, and now it's going to include the COVID pandemic a little bit, and the postponement.
So I'm working on something sort of brand new. I can't really say too many coherent things about it at this point, but it's set in the same part of the world as my first 2 novels, Southwestern Pennsylvania. So I sort of see it as there's a third and like a cycle. Not the same characters, although some may appear in this one that appeared in my other 2, but it's going to sort of delve into the nature of belief and impossibilities and what happens when impossibilities take on a life of their own and become possible in people's lives in this small town. So we'll see. I'm drafting it longhand right now. I find that helps me focus a lot more. We'll see if I get there. I'm close to having a complete draft. We'll see. We'll see if
wow, that's exciting.
Yeah, we'll see.
Lovely. Well, thank you both so much. This was an absolutely wonderful conversation. If y'all that are watching enjoyed this conversation today, please consider supporting Alena and supporting Margo by buying a copy of Mercy House, buying a copy of The Distance from 4 Points, and please consider supporting our bookstore by buying it through us.
You have assigned book plates, so that's an incentive.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes. Please, get your book, get those book plates.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Margo.
Have a wonderful rest of your night.